Mornings in the northern suburbs always began with a kind of light, cold, pure, and sharp as steel. In his silver-gray kitchen, Victor Langston sat alone beside a cup of coffee gone cold. The light streamed through the frosted glass, slicing his face in half, one side bright, the other dark, like an unfinished sketch. No smell of food, no sound of voices, only the heavy tick of the clock and the quiet breathing of a house far too large for one man. Victor had once been a celebrated name in the world of high-end architecture. People still spoke of him as the man who created the golden age of minimalist glasshouses, spaces where light itself was the main material. Now, those masterpieces were scattered across the city, while he lived quietly in one of them, a statue inside the museum of his own making. The kitchen still gleamed like a showroom, but there was no one left to admire it. He didn't cook, he didn't host. The late-night conversations were gone. Only silence remained, the very thing he once longed for in his youth, now his only companion. On the wall hung a faded photograph. Victor stood beside a young woman with a pregnant belly, both of them smiling. The picture was small, like a quiet reminder he'd spent years trying to forget. The woman in the photo, Rosalind, had once been his entire world. But that world had long since left him, taking with it a life he'd never met. He never went looking for them, perhaps because he knew he didn't deserve forgiveness. That spring, Victor decided to hire a new housekeeper. The house was far too big, and he'd started to forget where he left his keys. The woman recommended to him was Delia Warren, a black woman in her 40s, sturdy in build with a soft-spoken voice. Delia came with her daughter, Marin, a girl of about 11, with a halo of tangled curls and pale gray eyes like morning mist. When Delia asked if she could bring her daughter along during the school break, Victor hesitated. He didn't like children. Children meant laughter, footsteps, voices, all the things that shattered the silence he guarded like a fortress. But when he met the patient, slightly weary gaze of the woman before him, he simply nodded. As long as she doesn't make noise. On their first morning there, Marin sat on the porch steps, a sketchbook in her arms, her eyes wandering across the garden. She didn't ask questions, didn't touch anything, just watched. It was as if she were listening to the house whisper something adults could no longer hear. Delia cleaned each room with the care of someone who knew she was walking through a sacred space. Victor, as usual, stayed in the library, the only room he truly lived in. On the desk, old blueprints lay scattered in uneven stacks. He still opened them every day, though there were no projects left to finish. Perhaps it was his way of proving he still existed. By afternoon, sunlight spilled across the wooden floor like faded yellow paint. Delia was wiping the glass doors, and Marin was still sitting quietly under the elm tree in the yard. From the library window, Victor watched as the girl reached out to catch the falling leaves and press them between the pages of her sketchbook. He didn't understand why the sight of it felt both gentle and unsettling. There was something about this child, the way she watched, the way she stayed silent, that stirred a memory he had tried so hard to bury. That night, while Delia set the table, Victor ate only a few spoonfuls of soup before standing up. From the living room came the faint sound of Marin humming, a tune without words, just long, drifting notes like the wind. He almost told Delia to make her stop, but then he didn't. The sound was soft, fragile, warm, like a breath slipping through the cracks of this silent house. Before going to bed, Victor stood by the window, looking out at the garden. The shadows of mother and daughter stretched long beneath the porch light. Delia was tidying up her tools, while Marin lay on the grass, one arm reaching toward the sky as if she could touch a star. He realized it had been a very long time since anyone had looked at the sky from this garden. The house was still quiet, but not completely silent anymore. Something small, delicate, like the breath of a memory, had begun to stir in the air. The next morning, as the new sunlight touched the large window pane, Victor heard a faint rustling sound from the corner of the garden. He looked out and saw Marin sitting on the stone path, her eyes following the slow movement of a butterfly. She didn't chase it, just watched in silence, as if trying to understand why that tiny creature chose to land on one particular flower. There was something in her gaze that made him pause. It wasn't the look of a child, but of someone who had lived through more seasons than her years should allow. Since the mother and daughter had arrived, Victor spoke even less than usual. He wasn't irritated, just faintly on edge, though he couldn't say why. He realized Marin wasn't mischievous, nor did she ever make noise. She simply observed, her pale gray eyes seeming to look straight through the dust of time. When he walked down the hallway, he could feel her gaze following him, not curious, not afraid, just listening to something deep within the house itself. In Victor's library, where the light barely reached the bookshelves, hung an old photograph. A slender wooden frame encased the image of a young woman cradling her pregnant belly, standing beside a proud-looking young man. They stood together under a pale gray sky, as if time itself had paused in that moment. The man in the photo was Victor, many years ago, when he still believed love and ambition could coexist. That photograph was the one thing he never had the courage to throw away, yet never dared to look at directly. He left it there, on the library wall, a place few ever entered. That afternoon, while Delia was cleaning the living room, Marin wandered through the hallway. The faint scent of soap drifted in the air, mingling with the soft rhythm of the cloth on wood. She counted each stair as she walked, then stopped before the library door, left slightly ajar. Inside, light filtered through a thin curtain, settling like dust in the air. Marin stepped inside, so quietly it was as if she were afraid to disturb the room's very breath. The girl looked up, and her eyes landed on the photograph. The image of the woman holding her pregnant belly made her freeze. She stepped closer, eyes widening, then stopped completely. The woman's skin tone, her posture, her smile, and the gaze of the man beside her, everything about it held the girl still. Marin didn't know how long she stood there. Time seemed to stretch into thin, fragile threads. Her small hand clenched the edge of her sketchbook, then let go. Her eyes darkened as if something had quietly fallen inside her heart. Footsteps echoed behind her. Victor appeared in the doorway, his shadow stretching long across the wooden floor. His gaze flicked to the photograph, then to the girl. His voice was low, steady, and cold. "You're not allowed in here without an adult." Marin didn't turn away. She stood still, staring straight at him. Between them hung a silence so deep that only the sound of the wind brushing against the glass could be heard. Just as Victor was about to repeat himself, Marin spoke, her voice so soft he had to lean forward to catch it. "The baby in her belly, he used to live at the same orphanage as me." The words fell, light but sharp as broken glass. Victor froze. He didn't understand what the girl meant, yet every syllable struck something deep within his chest. He turned toward the photograph, the face of Rosalind, that smile, her hand resting on her belly. For an instant, he felt himself slipping backward through time to a distant afternoon when she had once said, "You'll be a good father, you just don't know how yet." He swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice. "What did you just say?" Marin lowered her eyes. "His name was Theo. He used to live at Willow Hill Orphanage. He said his mother died giving birth to him. Nobody ever knew who his father was. But he had a picture just like this one, only his was torn at the corner." Victor couldn't breathe. His hand gripped the edge of the table, feeling the bite of cold metal against his skin. "How do you know that?" he asked, his voice rough and breaking. "I used to share a room with him," Marin replied softly. "He liked to draw. He'd draw houses with pointed roofs and round windows. He said that was where he once belonged." Victor said nothing. A dull humming filled his head, like wind rushing through an empty pipe. He didn't believe it. He couldn't. His world had always been built on logic, on numbers, precision, and control. Yet something in the girl's quiet voice splintered those foundations, one crack at a time. He felt his heartbeat quicken, then slow, then almost stop. Marin's eyes stayed on him. No accusation, no fear. Just the calmness of someone stating a simple fact. He wanted to dismiss it, to end the conversation right there, but his body refused to move. The room seemed to shrink around them, growing tighter, though neither of them had taken a single step. When Delia stepped into the room, the air was already thick with tension. She saw the photograph, saw the look in her employer's eyes, saw her daughter's face, and understood that something had just crossed the line between ordinary conversation and something far deeper. But Victor said nothing. He simply turned away and slowly walked out of the room. Outside, the last light of day had faded to gray. Each step he took echoed faintly, as if the sound came from inside him rather than the floor. He didn't want to believe the girl's words, yet some old instinct deep in his chest began to tremble, the kind of trembling he hadn't felt in years. That night, Victor couldn't sleep. He lay on the wide bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, listening to the faint whistle of wind against the window frame. Everything in the house was as silent as always, but the silence no longer felt peaceful. It was thick, heavy, pressing slowly against his chest. Marin's words echoed in his mind, each one as small and sharp as a grain of sand slipping into an old wound. The baby in her belly. He used to live at the same orphanage as me. In the blur of memory, a face surfaced. Rosalind, with her dark brown hair always loosely tied and a laugh that was impossible not to catch. They had met at an architecture exhibition, back when Victor was just beginning to make a name for himself. She was an art critic, witty, intelligent, with a voice that made people want to keep listening. They fell in love quickly. In that way, youth always believes it can hold on to everything. Evenings were spent sitting on the floor, sketching imaginary houses, and talking about the places they would go. Rosalind loved planting things. Victor only knew how to draw gardens he'd never touched with his own hands. When she told him she was pregnant, Victor stayed silent for a long time. At that moment, he was standing at the edge of his big break, an offer from a major architecture firm in Boston, his first real chance to put his name on a magazine cover. He thought he could have both, but fear of responsibility, of losing control, of being ordinary, drove the young man to choose otherwise. "I just need more time," he'd said, and Rosalind had simply nodded. She left a few weeks later, leaving behind a short handwritten note. Just a few lines. "I don't blame you. I just think a child needs more than waiting." Victor kept that letter for years. Never burned it, but never found the courage to read it again. He didn't know where she went, didn't know if the child was ever born, and over time, the guilt settled like the dust that gathered on the photograph hanging in his library. Now, hearing the name Theo from Marin's lips, that dust seemed to scatter into the air. He sat up, got out of bed, and walked toward the library. The room was bathed in a dim blue glow from the night outside. Rosalind's picture was still there, but this time he couldn't bear to look at it for long. He felt cold, even though the fireplace was still burning. By morning, as Delia prepared to leave the house, Marin stood quietly on the porch, clutching her worn sketchbook. Victor saw her, and for the first time, he spoke first. "Marin," he called. She turned, hesitating for a moment, but her eyes did not look away. "What you said last night about the boy named Theo?" he asked, his voice rough, as if afraid of his own question. "Are you sure?" Marin looked down at her sketchbook, then slowly opened it. Between the yellowed pages, she pulled out a crumpled sheet of paper, its edges torn and soft with age. She held it out to him carefully with both hands, as if handing over something fragile. It was a drawing. The pencil lines were faint, but clear enough. A house with a pointed roof and a round window on the second floor. On the balcony stood a man, one hand resting on the railing, gazing out toward the garden below. Behind him rose tall trees and a gray sky. Victor recognized it instantly. Every detail, every line belonged to the house he was living in now, the one he had designed so many years ago, at the very start of his career. He held his breath. "Who drew this?" he asked. Marin's voice was barely above a whisper. "Theo did. He always drew this place. He said, 'This is where I used to belong.'" Victor sank into a chair, still gripping the trembling sheet of paper. The room suddenly felt too bright. He looked closer, the roofline, the angle of the window, the posture of the man on the balcony. There was no doubt, it was his sketch, the very first draft he'd ever made of this house when he was still a student. A design that had never been published, never shown to anyone, never even left his own hands. How could that boy have known what this place looked like? Victor murmured, almost asking himself. Delia stepped out from the kitchen just then and stopped when she saw him staring at the drawing. Marin remained still, her eyes deep and far older than her years. "He said this place was always in his head," she replied quietly, "that someone once promised to come back for him, but no one ever did." Victor closed his eyes. Memories flooded back, fragmented, disjointed. Rosalind's hand resting on his blueprint, her smile as she spoke of a house for three, the soft afternoon light spilling through the window they had once dreamed of. It all returned, carrying with it the dull ache he thought he had long buried. He opened his eyes again and looked at the paper. The page was yellowed, the edges worn and folded many times. Tiny smudges of a child's fingerprints were still faintly visible. A child had held onto this image, drawing it again and again, as if to keep from forgetting. Marin's voice dropped to a whisper. "He said this house was real, only no one believed him." Victor lowered his head. He no longer believed in coincidence. The trembling inside him had turned into something else, a mix of fear and hope, emotions he'd forgotten how to bear. Gently, he laid the drawing on the table, his hands still shaking. Then he stood, turning away so no one would see the glimmer in his eyes. The house, long silent for so many years, suddenly made a faint sound, a creak in the wood, like a quiet sigh. Perhaps it was just the wind, but Victor felt something shift, as if the cracks within him had been touched for the first time in decades by someone unafraid to reach in. When Delia learned what Marin had told Victor, her face went pale. She was folding towels in the kitchen when she heard his heavy footsteps coming down the stairs, then stopping at the doorway. He said nothing, just stood there, looking at the two of them. That look alone told her that her daughter had said too much. She quickly wiped her hands on her apron, trying to steady her trembling voice. "Mr. Langston? She just has a vivid imagination, that's all. She's always made up stories like that since she was little. Please don't take it seriously." Victor remained silent. He turned his gaze toward Marin, who sat curled in her chair at the corner of the table, her gray eyes calm and still. There was nothing fabricated in that look. Delia stepped forward and placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, protective, apologetic. "I'm sorry if she upset you. I'll tell her not to say things like that again." "No need," Victor said, his voice rough and low. "She only said what she believes. Isn't that right?" Marin nodded softly. Delia quickly took her by the hand and led her out, closing the door behind them. Inside the kitchen, Victor stood alone. He pressed a hand to his forehead, a wave of exhaustion washing over him, but beneath it, something else stirred. A quiet urge, a pull, as if someone had just nudged open an old locked door in the back of his mind. That evening, he sat in the library. The room was awash in the glow of warm yellow light, yet the chill wouldn't leave. On the table lay Theo's drawing. Victor reached out, touched the edge of the paper, then pulled his hand back, afraid to leave a fingerprint. Every piece of logic in his mind insisted this was only coincidence. There were thousands of houses with pointed roofs. Hundreds of people who might know the name Langston. But then he thought of the lines of the drawing, the slant of the balcony, the figure standing there, the way the man's head tilted slightly down. Too specific. Too familiar. He stood and walked toward the study upstairs, a room that hadn't been opened in years. The key was still in the desk drawer. When the lock clicked open, a breath of old paper and dry wood drifted out. Inside, everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. He switched on the light. The dim bulb flickered to life, illuminating rows of filing shelves and old boxes. On the wall, a calendar still hung, stopped at the year 2004. Victor pulled open a drawer. Inside were stacks of folders labeled by hand, the slanted handwriting unmistakably his own. He sifted through them, one by one, envelope by envelope. And then, buried among the brittle papers, he found a yellowed envelope. Its corners darkened with age. The handwriting on it trembled, thin and almost faded away. To Victor Langston. He sat down, staring at the envelope as if it were something alien. He knew exactly where it came from. It was the letter Rosalind had sent all those years ago. The one the postman said contained documents inside, but that he had never opened. Back then, he'd told himself he didn't need to know. Now, his hands wouldn't stop shaking as he broke the seal. Inside was a carefully folded sheet of paper and a copy of a birth certificate. The light from the lamp fell across the fading handwritten words. Theo R. Langston. Under Father, Victor Langston. He read the name over and over again, each letter cutting deep, small, deliberate wounds in a place he thought had long since gone numb. He could still hear Rosalind's voice, gentle but steady, saying, "I don't need you to be ready right now. I just need you not to disappear." But he had disappeared, completely, without a word. He set the paper on the desk and pressed his hands to his temples. The room seemed to tilt slightly. The wind outside sounded like a whisper he couldn't quite make out. He didn't know where to begin. Every trace of the past felt erased, except for the few fading lines on that document and the words of a strange little girl who shouldn't have known any of it. The next day, Victor went to find Marin. She was sitting on the porch, sketching with a dull pencil. "What do you remember about Willow Hill?" he asked. Marin looked up, a little surprised. "I remember, but it's closed now." "Why do you ask?" "You said that boy, Theo. How long was he there?" "I don't really know," she replied. "He was already there when I arrived. He was older than me by a few years. Then one day, someone came and said he was being transferred. Nobody knew where. After that, the orphanage got into trouble, lawsuits and all, and then it shut down for good." Victor listened, and his chest tightened with every word. He thanked her quietly, then went back inside. Something restless stirred in him, a pull he couldn't quite name. He returned to his study and turned on the old computer. The machine hummed to life slowly, the faint blue glow filling the dim room. He began searching for anything he could find about Willow Hill Orphanage. Most of the results were outdated. Some links no longer worked. What remained were fragments, local news clippings mentioning a long court case about poor living conditions and missing records. The lawsuit had dragged on for 5 years before the orphanage was shut down. The files had been transferred elsewhere. No list of names, no trace of anyone. He leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. The old guilt came rushing back, heavier than before. Was this the cost of silence? A life lost because he hadn't opened a letter. His eyes drifted around the room. Every object seemed to accuse him in its stillness. Delia stepped in, carrying a tray of tea. Her gaze fell on the birth certificate spread open on the desk, and worry flickered across her face. "Mr. Langston," she said softly, "please, don't let this consume you. The girl just makes things up sometimes. Kids remember wrong, they mix stories, don't torture yourself over it." Victor didn't answer. He only watched the steam curling up from the teacup, thin, trembling wisps that rose and vanished into nothing. "It's not imagination, Delia," he said quietly. "It can't be. I need to know what happened." Delia set the tray down, her voice softening. "You can't change the past, Mr. Langston." "No," Victor replied slowly, "but I can stop running from it." She bowed her head, said nothing more, and quietly left the room. Silence settled again, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Victor opened the drawer, carefully folded the letter and the birth certificate, and placed them inside. Then he sat, staring out the window. Outside, a light rain had begun to fall. He watched the droplets slide down the glass, merging with the dark outlines of the trees reflected there. In that moment, he felt small, smaller than he had in years, inside the house he had built with his own hands. Everything he had designed to be perfect, the clean lines, the sharp corners, the careful balance of light, now felt cold and hollow. He realized then that no blueprint could ever hide a void in the human heart. And perhaps, from that moment on, the true cost of denial began to take shape, clearer, heavier, and more real than ever before. The next morning, the house was so quiet that Victor could hear the soft dripping of rain from the eaves outside. Delia had gone to the market early, leaving only him and Maren at home. He sat in the living room, Theo's drawing still lying on the table. Maren sat across from him, her hands clasped together, her eyes uncertain. Neither spoke for several long minutes. At last, it was Maren who broke the silence. "Mr. Langston, I think I should tell you the rest, about Theo." Victor gave a small nod. He wasn't sure he was ready, but he no longer wanted to run from it either. Maren looked down at the floor, her voice so soft it seemed to tremble in the air between them. "He was the only one at the orphanage who ever stood up for me." She told him how, back then, at Willow Hill, there was a group of older kids who liked to bully the younger ones. One day, they'd snatched her sketchbook and thrown it into a puddle. When Maren tried to grab it back, one of them shoved her so hard she hit her head on the floor. Everyone else looked away. Only Theo stepped forward. He didn't say a word, just placed himself between her and the others, his eyes calm, almost unnervingly so. They hit him, kicked him, but he didn't fight back. When it was over, he quietly picked up her sketchbook, wiped the mud from the cover with his sleeve, and handed it back to her. "Keep it," it said, "because no one else will." As she spoke, Maren pressed her lips together as if holding back the weight of an old memory. "After that day," she said softly, "he started leaving drawings in my sketchbook. Never any words, just pictures. He said that was his way of comforting people." She opened her bag and took out a small bundle of papers tied with a worn ribbon. Carefully, she untied it and handed it to him. "I've kept them since I left the orphanage. I never thought anyone would ever need to see them again." Victor accepted the bundle and began to unfold each sheet, one by one. The drawings were clumsy yet filled with feeling, scenes of quiet peace, a garden, a window frame, a lone figure standing under a porch. But when he reached the fourth sketch, he froze. It showed a rain-soaked afternoon, a man standing in the rain beside a woman holding an umbrella tilted toward him. The two of them faced the same direction, half hidden beneath the umbrella's edge. Victor's heart pounded. He knew that scene. It was from a long-ago afternoon. He and Rosalind, sheltering from the rain outside the first construction site he ever worked on. She had laughed and said that rain makes people more honest than sunlight does. No one else had been there. No one else could have known. His hand trembled as he held the drawing. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly, that he never saw a photo like this, or heard anyone talk about it. Marin shook her head. I don't think so. No one at the orphanage ever knew anything about you. But he used to dream about a man in the rain. He said the man looked sad, though he didn't know why. He thought, maybe that was someone he'd once been waiting for. Victor sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the drawing. The light from the window spilled across it, catching the faint, that smudged pencil lines that formed the falling rain. He really said that? Victor's voice rasped, barely audible. Marin nodded. She lifted her gaze, those pale gray eyes bright yet sorrowful. He used to whisper something else too, she said softly. He'd say, he doesn't know I exist, but I'll remember him instead of hating him. The words struck Victor like an unseen blow. His body leaned forward, as though the air itself had shifted against him. He bowed his head into his hands, breath ragged and heavy. All those years of solitude, he had told himself that if a child ever did exist, that child would hate him for not being there, for not searching, for not speaking his name. And now, he knew the truth. There had been a child, one who chose not to hate, even though they had never met. He didn't cry. He just sat there, still feeling something inside him dissolve. Pain and relief woven together. For the first time in years, he felt his heart move. Marin watched him, her hands resting gently on the remaining drawings. Mr. Langston, she said softly, I don't think he ever hated you. He once said, people can't hate what they never had, but they can remember it forever. Victor lifted his head. His voice came out low, rough, heavy with remorse. Where's that boy now? Marin lowered her gaze, clutching the bundle of papers tighter. I don't know. They took him somewhere else when the orphanage closed. No one told me where. But I kept the drawings he made for me. He told me not to lose them, because someday, someone might want to see them. Victor looked at her for a long time, his eyes warm yet full of sorrow. The drawings in his hands trembled slightly as a breeze slipped through the window frame. Each line, each stroke seemed to whisper the story of someone he had lost, and of a child who had once believed in him when he himself no longer did. The room fell silent again. But this time, it wasn't the hollow kind of silence that used to fill the house. It felt alive, like the lingering breath of a memory weaving through the air, brushing gently against everything around them. And in that quiet, Victor understood more clearly than ever. Absence has its own voice. And the true cost of denial isn't losing others, it's losing yourself. After that conversation, Victor hardly left the library. On the desk, Theo's drawings rested neatly inside a small wooden box, and beside it lay the old birth certificate, its folds still sharply creased. He would sit there for hours, staring out the window at the branches swaying in the wind. Inside him, a space had opened, no longer filled with fear, but with a quiet, insistent need to know the truth. A few days later, he called a private investigator. The man's name was Miles, about 50, with a steady, detached voice, the kind that belonged to someone who'd seen too many of other people's secrets to be curious anymore. Victor handed him a copy of the birth certificate, the year of birth, and the name. Theo R. Langston. Miles nodded, asked a few brief questions, then said it would take some time. When the call ended, Victor noticed his hand was still trembling slightly. He had spent years watching his past from a safe distance, never daring to interfere, and now, taking action made his heart beat faster than he wanted to admit. While waiting for news, he began tracing the fragments left behind by Rosalind. He went to the old boarding house where they had once lived when they were young. The building stood on a narrow street, paint peeling, balconies rusted, yet still holding the quiet shape of years gone by. The new manager looked at the photo of Rosalind that Victor carried, then slowly shook his head. She's gone, the man said softly. A few years ago. Cancer. No family left. Some neighbors took care of the funeral. There were a few of her things left in the room, but nobody ever came to claim them. Victor stood still for a long moment. Then he quietly asked permission to see her old room. It was small, the pale yellow walls faded with age, the window coated in a thick layer of dust. On the desk sat a few notebooks, an old ceramic vase, and a picture frame with no photo inside. He stepped carefully, as if afraid to disturb the last traces of someone who once filled the space with life. He sat down in the chair by the desk and opened the notebooks, one by one. Rosalind's handwriting was just as he remembered, soft, slightly slanted, carrying the weary grace of someone writing late at night. In one of the journals, between scattered notes and half-finished thoughts, he found a single line. I never blamed Victor. I just wasn't strong enough to make someone choose what they weren't ready for. He stopped, staring at the words for a long time. Short, simple, but they cut deep. In the stillness of the room, he could hear his own breath. Rough, uneven. He read the line again, then gently closed the notebook. In his mind, her image returned. That calm, tired smile, the soft eyes looking out through the window, her hand resting on her belly as the wind brushed past. All his life, Victor had believed he understood every design, every blueprint, every structure. But now he realized, the one thing he had never understood was a heart. When he left the room, Victor took only one thing, the small notebook. Nothing else. On his way back, he stopped at a small cafe near the train station. It was late afternoon. Sunlight streamed through the glass window, casting silhouettes of passing strangers onto the tables. Around him, laughter mingled with soft music, and the rich scent of roasted coffee lingered in the air. Amid that gentle hum of life, Victor sat quietly, turning the worn pages, reading the old words as if speaking with someone who had long since gone. The more he read, the heavier his heart became. There were lines Rosalind had written for the child she hadn't yet met, telling him that even if your father isn't here, you are still loved. Other passages spoke of her fear of giving birth alone, followed by the fragile joy of hearing her baby's first cry. Each word felt like a heartbeat, aged but still warm. He didn't know how long he sat there. It wasn't until the waiter refilled his glass that he noticed the coffee had gone cold. Outside, the city lights had begun to glow. People were laughing, meeting, talking about tomorrow. And Victor sat among them, surrounded by the sound of life, his heart heavy with a silence too full to name. The cafe door opened, and the small bell above it chimed softly. Maren stepped inside, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. She looked around, then spotted him sitting in the far corner. Victor lifted his head, surprise flickering across his tired eyes. Maren walked over, set her bag down, and sat beside him without a word. Her gaze fell on the notebook lying open on the table. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked quietly. Victor looked at her, his expression gentle but weary. "I found what I'd lost," he said. Maren opened her satchel and took out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to him carefully. "Theo drew this for me before he was taken away," she said. "I think you should have it." Victor unfolded the page. On it were two hands, one large, one small, clasped tightly together. The pencil strokes were soft, the lines simple, yet achingly sincere. He stared at it for a long time, then placed his palm over the larger hand in the drawing, as if trying to feel its warmth. He said, Maren continued in a whisper, "When people lose each other, as long as one of them still remembers how to hold on, there's still a way back." Victor didn't speak. He only nodded slightly, his finger tracing the line of the drawn hand. Outside, night had fully settled. Inside the cafe, the warm yellow light spilled across the table, catching the deep lines at the corners of his eyes, the marks of time, of regret, and of something slowly mending itself, however late, however fragile. The search stretched on for more than 8 months. Each week, Miles, the private investigator, sent Victor a new report, neatly typed and full of notes. Every lead, every name traced through the old records of Willow Hill. Most of them led nowhere. Some children had changed their names, some had moved away, some files had simply vanished. But Victor didn't stop. Whenever exhaustion crept in, he would open the small wooden box that held Theo's drawings, look at them for a long time, then pick up the phone again, calling, writing, following the faint trails that memory and time had tried to erase. Then one autumn morning, as sunlight filtered through the window, the phone rang. It was Miles. His voice, calm and clipped as always, carried something different this time. "I think I've found him." Victor went still, breath caught halfway. "His name is Theo Reynolds," Miles continued. "Same birth year. Records show he once used the surname Langston before it was changed after adoption. He's working at a small carpentry shop out west, in a town called Elridge." Victor sat motionless for a while, unable to tell whether what he felt was relief or fear. The name, Reynolds, sounded foreign, but everything else did not. He thanked Miles, hung up the phone, and sat in the quiet of his house. On the table, the copy of Theo's drawing, the pointed roof house, rested among his familiar things, as if waiting to be taken somewhere it belonged. A week later, Victor drove west. The road stretched long and still, lined with endless rows of pine trees. Old, faded road signs appeared now and then, their letters half-worn by weather and time. When he reached Elridge, the sun was just breaking through the clouds. The scent of fresh-cut wood and pine resin drifted on the breeze. He stopped the car in front of a small carpentry shop, where the rhythmic hum of saws and the low murmur of conversation filled the air. Through the dusty window, he saw a group of workers. Among them, a young man stood tall and broad-shouldered, his hair slightly tousled, laughing at something a coworker said. And in that instant, Victor knew. The way he stood, the way he tilted his head to listen, the way his hands gripped the wood, as though it were something alive. The sight of him caught in Victor's throat, and he could not breathe for a moment. He didn't get out right away. He sat in the car, both hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the figure outside. The young man had no idea someone was watching him. He worked steadily, his eyes bright, his smile calm. He looked content, like someone who had built a life of his own, a life that didn't need Victor in it. Victor felt the weight settle in his chest. He didn't know if he still had any place in that life, or if showing up now would only disturb what was already whole. He had built so many homes in his lifetime, yet this was the first time he'd stood before one that wasn't his, a life, not a building, and wondered whether he had any right to step inside. Beside him, Maren sat in the passenger seat. She had grown taller since the first time they met, her features more defined, the softness of childhood replaced by quiet composure. She watched him for a moment, then asked softly, "Are you afraid?" Victor nodded. "I don't know what I'd even say if I went in there. I don't know how to call him, or whether he'd even want to see me." Maren turned toward him, her voice calm but sure. "I think he'd want to know that someone was waiting for him all along." The words made Victor close his eyes for a moment. He drew in a deep breath, then opened the car door. The wind rushed in, carrying with it the scent of fresh wood and the faint sound of laughter from the workshop. He brought no business card, no documents, no title to hide behind. Only one thing rested in the pocket of his coat, a copy of the drawing, the first one Theo had ever made of this house. Victor walked slowly down the path toward the workshop. With every step, it felt as though he were counting the years he'd lost. The young man hadn't noticed him yet. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting two long shadows that slowly drew closer. One old, one young, separated by only a few feet, yet by the span of an entire lifetime. Victor stopped. Theo looked up, perhaps catching the sound of footsteps. For a moment, the world went utterly still. Neither spoke. Their eyes met, strangers' eyes, yet bound by something ancient and unspoken. Victor didn't reach out his hand. He didn't speak the name. Instead, he opened the small leather pouch, took out the drawing, and carefully held it forward. The light caught on the page, revealing the sketch of the pointed roof house, the man standing on the balcony, looking out toward the garden. Theo looked at the drawing, puzzled at first. He set down the piece of wood he was holding, wiped his hands on his apron, and stepped closer. Stopping a few feet away, he studied it, his voice low and rough with confusion. "This? Who drew this?" Victor's reply came barely above a whisper. "A boy named Theo. He drew it when he lived at Willow Hill." Theo's eyes widened. He looked at Victor for a long time, then back at the drawing. His lips parted, as if he wanted to say something, but couldn't find where to begin. Victor stood still, his hand trembling slightly as it held the edge of the paper. His eyes, though unsteady, stayed fixed on the young man before him. "I once had a friend," Theo said softly. "She told me there was a man who looked just like the one in this picture. She said, maybe he was looking for me." Victor nodded slowly. Maybe she was right. His voice caught for a moment before he went on. "I don't expect you to call me anything. I just wanted to see you. Once, in person." A gentle wind passed between them, carrying the scent of pine resin and the warmth of sunlight into the quiet space that separated their lives. Theo looked at him, the sharpness in his gaze softening. Then, quietly, he asked, "How far did you come to get here?" Victor's answer came without hesitation. "A lifetime." Theo didn't speak again. He only stepped closer and reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the drawing. The distance between them narrowed, not through words, but through the silence of two people long tired of time's weight. And in that stillness, Victor noticed Theo's hand. Broad, warm, the veins pronounced, so achingly familiar. It was, unmistakably, the same hand he once had when he was young. He smiled. A small, quiet smile, but a real one. "You draw beautifully," he said. "And I think there's still a lot left for you to put on paper." Theo let out a soft laugh and nodded. "Maybe today will be one of those things." Victor gave a slow nod in return. His eyes glistened, but the sadness was gone. He folded the drawing gently, not to keep it, but to offer it forward. This time his hand didn't hold tight. He extended it halfway, leaving space for the other hand to meet it. When their hands touched, neither spoke. There was only warmth, and a strange quiet certainty, as if the past and the present, two separate halves of one life, had finally learned how to exist in the same frame. A short distance away, Maren stood by the car, watching. She saw Victor lower his head slightly, and the young man nod in return. They didn't embrace, they didn't cry. They simply stood there, side by side, looking toward the same horizon, where the sunlight spilled across the forest, golden and gentle, like a promise spoken late but still worth believing in.